Hey guys, tonight, we're going to take a slow, quiet stroll into the opulent, chaotic, and sometimes just plain bizarre world of the Mughal court. So, dim the lights, maybe pull your blanket a little closer, and let yourself sink into the soft, lingering echo of palace corridors, the faint clink of golden dishes, and the hushed gossip that never quite left the marble halls. No sudden surprises, no loud thumps, just a gentle drift through history that might help you, eventually, float into sleep. Now, the Mughal Empire, it was one of those states that looked stunning on the outside. Huge, gleaming forts, gardens that seemed to go on forever, and palaces dripping with gold and gemstones. A true Instagram dream if Instagram had existed in the 16th century. But behind the shine, of course, was life. Messy, petty, sometimes tragic life. And that's where our story begins. Because if you think the royals were always elegant, poised, and wise, well, the Mughal court will gently prove you wrong. Let's start with Emperor Jahangir. He ruled in the early 1600s and was supposedly sophisticated, art-loving, deeply cultured, and devoted to painting and poetry. And yes, he did all those things. But here's the thing. Jahangir was also, let's say, a creature of habit. Habits that would make modern doctors wince. He loved wine, for one, and opium. And if you combine the two, you get an emperor who, despite his title, sometimes struggled to remember which palace he was supposed to be ruling from. Imagine ordering the treasury audited while mildly drifting off into a flower garden nap. That's basically Jahangir. And then there's his love life. Oh, this one's quietly fascinating. Jahangir married Nisa, who we now know as the famous Nur Jahan. She wasn't just a pretty face or a loyal consort. She was clever, politically shrewd, and had a sense of style that could probably intimidate modern fashion editors. And the slightly scandalous part, she basically ran the empire behind the scenes. Yes, behind the scenes. While Jahangir occasionally nodded, drank wine, or painted little portraits of his pet animals, Nur Jahan was arranging marriages, directing armies, and gently nudging ministers in the right or wrong direction. It's a little like hiring a personal assistant who slowly takes over your entire office. Except, in this case, the office is a continent-sized empire. But before we get too comfortable with that image, let's float over to another palace oddity, Jahangir's son, Khurram. You might know him as Shah Jahan later on, the builder of the Taj Mahal. Cute story, right? Except, young Khurram had a tiny problem that historians tend to whisper about. He was, how shall we say, slightly too dramatic for his own good. Teenagers today have mood swings that drive their parents crazy. Khurram had those same swings multiplied by a court full of sycophants, servants, and jealous uncles. One day, he's reading poetry and touching the moonlight as if it owes him a sonnet. The next, he's glaring at his father because someone suggested he should wear a simpler robe. And somehow, that chaotic energy eventually produced a ruler whose architectural taste was impeccable, but personal life, well, let's just say it was a quiet train wreck. Now, if you thought dynastic drama stopped at teenagers, welcome to the next layer, sibling rivalries. Mughal princes were expected to compete for the throne. Peaceful debates over policy? Not so much. Subtle assassinations, quiet betrayals, and whispered intrigues were more the style. And, interestingly, sometimes the princes who seemed most charming and harmless like little stars in the palace gardens were actually meticulously plotting the downfall of the slightly less charming brother. It's like watching a slow-motion chess game, where some of the pieces are human and occasionally scream at each other. Let's linger for a moment on a quieter scandal. Jahangir, despite being married to Nur Jahan, had a particular fondness for the ladies of the court, and apparently for goldfish. Or at least, that's how some of his contemporaries described his devotion to trivial pleasures. He reportedly spent hours inspecting gardens, tasting exotic fruits, and writing poetic letters that sometimes seemed more passionate than the average love letters in history books. And here's the part that subtly tickles the imagination. Some of those letters were to women whose identities remain mysteriously vague. Did he cross lines? Probably. But the intrigue of who was who quietly percolated through the palace corridors for decades. No loud scandals were ever announced in public, just the gentle hum of gossip, like the soft ripple of a fountain at midnight. Speaking of midnight, the Mughal court had its fair share of strange, almost comically petty conflicts. One that historians love to point out involves a rather minor, but symbolically important incident with palace chefs. Jahangir apparently demanded that the taste of fruit in the imperial kitchen be perfect. And I mean, seriously perfect. One slightly overripe mango, and the chief cook might find himself gently reassigned. The emperor's taste buds were so fastidious that court correspondences sometimes included detailed reports about which fruits were sufficiently fragrant and which were offensively sour. Now, in fairness, that's also probably how you end up with paintings where every petal looks exactly like a real flower. But also, imagine being the guy whose sole purpose is not to anger the emperor by underperforming with fruit. That's palace life. Subtly tragic yet quietly amusing if you're reading this from centuries later. Now, let's drift back to Shah Jahan young Khurram and his rather complicated relationships. He was married multiple times, partly for political alliances, and partly because, well, that's what royalty did. His personal diary hints at a subtle obsession with his favorite wives, while simultaneously being distracted by art and architecture. He was, according to letters and accounts, deeply passionate and occasionally excessively melancholic. For example, when one of his beloved wives passed away, he went into a gentle, lingering sorrow that lasted years. And yes, that's when he eventually commissioned the Taj Mahal, a monument that is simultaneously a love story, an architectural masterpiece, and, when you think about it, a historical nap-inducer. The sort of monument that whispers quietly to the world, "I'm beautiful," and also slightly tragic. And speaking of whispers, the Mughal court was full of them. Ministers, concubines, cousins, even favorite pets. Everyone had a subtle role in the slow-moving drama of succession. There's a story about one particular minister who, despite being technically loyal to the emperor, occasionally plotted small, almost imperceptible acts of rebellion. Nothing loud, nothing confrontational, just the quiet, sleepy intrigue of palace politics. Like a cat gently pawing at a priceless vase. The emperor might notice, or he might just shrug and sip tea, and somehow, the court continued functioning, despite all the undercurrents, like a massive, lazy river of intrigue flowing through gold-plated gates. Now, the emotional lives of these emperors were, in a word, peculiar. Jahangir would reportedly weep quietly at poetry, Khurram would brood silently over tiny slights, and Nur Jahan, well, she managed all of it while wearing the most impeccably embroidered silks imaginable. There's a subtle irony here. The more controlled, luxurious, and polished the court looked on the surface, the more quietly chaotic it was underneath. And for us, centuries later, that's part of the charm. Not loud drama, not sword fights, not exploding tempers, but the slow, inexorable unraveling of human emotions beneath the gilded ceilings. It's like watching a sand timer in slow motion, and realizing every grain is a whispered secret. By the way, a aside on inbreeding, which is quietly fascinating. The Mughal royals often married cousins or other relatives to keep power within the family. Modern genetics would have gently frowned, but back then, it was simply considered efficient politics. And yes, that occasionally produced quirks, subtle physical traits, strange predispositions to illnesses, and sometimes unpredictable moods. If you imagine a court full of carefully painted portraits, each face a little unique, a little odd, that's exactly what the Mughals were, a perfectly curated gallery of human complexity, with the occasional eyebrow raised or limp hand gently resting on a jeweled table. And while we're lingering on personal quirks, there's Jahangir's penchant for pets. He loved all sorts of animals, including exotic birds, and even little lions. He'd reportedly carry them around the palace gardens, and sometimes they'd get into minor accidents, but he adored them. Imagine an emperor resplendent in silk and gold, carefully feeding a tiny lion cub, while ministers argue quietly over taxes in the background. It's a gentle, almost absurd image, the kind that makes you realize even the most powerful humans are still human. we could drift slowly into endless examples of subtle tragedies. Princes who couldn't inherit, favorites who lost influence, poets who were never fully appreciated. Every corner of the palace had a soft story to tell. Every corridor echoed with unspoken words. And somehow, amidst all of it, the empire thrived for centuries. Perhaps because all of that chaos was, in a strange way, organized. Like a soft, melodic chaos. The kind that might lull you into thinking. Yes, history is long. And maybe so am I, resting here quietly. So, for tonight, let's leave the Mughal court at that. We've glimpsed its quiet scandals, its slow-moving intrigues, its emotional oddities, and the gentle eccentricities of emperors who were, at their core, very human. Not perfect, not heroic in the usual sense, but charmingly flawed. Sleepy, even, if you imagine yourself as a fly on the wall of a marble palace, watching a lion cub stumble over a rug while ministers whisper politely in the background. And as you drift, maybe think about this. In a world of golden gates and slow-moving intrigues, life was messy, love was quiet, ambition was subtle, and yet somehow the whole thing endured. The Mughal court, the perfect place to gently lose yourself in the small, sad, slightly ridiculous, and deeply human dramas of history. Part 2: Shah Jahan and the subtle tragedies of court life. Alright, let's settle in again. Imagine the soft echo of your own breathing syncing with the gentle clatter of palace life, and drift into the world of Shah Jahan. Young Khurram, now fully grown, has claimed his place on the throne. But, as you might expect, ruling a sprawling empire isn't just about impressive buildings and portraits that make you look like a serene marble statue. No, it's about people. Lots of people, with slightly complicated, slightly exhausting quirks. And the more we drift into Shah Jahan's court, the more the subtle, quiet chaos unfolds. Shah Jahan was famously in love with Mumtaz Mahal, the woman who would eventually inspire the Taj Mahal. Their relationship is often romanticized in the modern imagination: grand gestures, endless devotion, poetic letters. But let's take a slow, quieter view. Shah Jahan was utterly obsessive. He doted on her with the same energy he might have devoted to inspecting a newly completed marble dome. He commissioned jewelry for her, gardens for her, palaces for her, and letters that detailed the gentle size of her hair, the soft curve of her hand. And Mumtaz, well, she indulged him mostly, while quietly managing her own household, children, and the subtle politics of the court. Imagine a marriage where one spouse essentially builds miniature monuments in the living room every week, while the other gently rolls their eyes. That's the slow rhythm of royal life. Speaking of children, Shah Jahan and Mumtaz had 14 of them. 14. Yes, 14 little princes and princesses running around the palace, each with their own dramatic tendencies, quirks, and minor schemes. Some historians have quietly observed that growing up in a Mughal harem must have been like living inside a very slow-moving soap opera. Children were trained to be graceful, politically aware, and endlessly patient. They were also prone to emotional meltdowns that, in a modern setting, might be slightly amusing, but in the palace, were gently catastrophic. Imagine a toddler loudly insisting that the emperor's robe is the wrong shade of blue, while a secretary carefully records court finances nearby. That's almost accurate, except replace the toddler with a slightly older prince plotting subtle palace intrigues. Now, if you've ever wondered why Mughal portraits sometimes look a little formal, that's partly because of the children. Princes were posed carefully to mask what might have been nervous tics, awkward expressions, or minor scowls. Tiny glimpses of personality the painters were tactfully instructed to smooth out. Princesses, on the other hand, were expected to maintain perfect posture, serene expressions, and a quiet intelligence. All of it meticulously curated, but underneath, the soft, unspoken chaos continued. Children whispered, cried, and occasionally schemed while the emperor and empress presided over the slow, endless rhythm of courtly life. And the subtle scandals of Shah Jahan's reign weren't limited to love letters or children. The court, as always, was a network of quiet intrigues. Ministers and advisors, each convinced of their own brilliance, would gently nudge policies, occasionally misplace an order for grain shipments, and sometimes quietly compete to be the emperor's favorite. Imagine a room full of adults subtly competing for the praise of someone who occasionally spends hours admiring a rose garden. That's not exactly chaos, but it is a slow-moving tension that hums gently in the background, like a purring cat that might decide to knock over a vase at any moment. One particularly soft scandal involves the delicate balance of succession. Shah Jahan had multiple sons, each trained in the art of subtle ambition. No one staged loud battles in the early days. Rather, there were whispered conversations, carefully worded letters, and minor disputes over seating arrangements at court dinners. Even the softest slight, say, a chair slightly closer to the emperor's throne, could set off weeks of quiet scheming. And somehow, the court survived all of this. The Mughal Empire, despite the undercurrents of ambition, jealousy, and quiet resentment, functioned with the rhythmic precision of a very slow, very ornate clock. Now, let's pause for a brief reflection on health and habits, which were, as always, slightly peculiar. Shah Jahan, like many Mughal rulers, was fond of fine food, elaborate perfumes, and gentle indulgences. He enjoyed long, slow meals with elaborate menus, often consisting of multiple courses featuring meats, spices, and sweets. Some of his favorite dishes were so rich that modern nutritionists might quietly faint. And yet, he somehow maintained the poise of a ruler, walking through gardens, inspecting palaces, and occasionally sighing over a slightly misshapen marble column. It's the sort of quietly obsessive attention to detail that historians find both fascinating and slightly exhausting to recount. And then, of course, there were the softer emotional scandals. Shah Jahan's affection for Mumtaz Mahal was, as mentioned, profound. But the grief he experienced when she passed away was monumental. He withdrew from certain aspects of court life, delegated responsibilities to ministers and family members, and devoted himself to the slow, deliberate construction of the Taj Mahal. Some accounts suggest he spent months simply wandering gardens, gently touching fountains, and softly reciting her name. It's not dramatic in a Hollywood sense, but it's deeply human, quietly tragic, and just the sort of thing that makes the Mughal story linger in your mind like a soft hum in the dark. Meanwhile, the younger children continued their quiet rivalries. Some historians have noted that even in childhood, princes exhibited subtle favoritism, quietly competing for the emperor's attention or attempting to curry favor with ministers. This wasn't loud shouting. It was a series of almost imperceptible gestures, carefully timed smiles, and slightly over-enthusiastic bows. And it mattered. Every soft interaction in the palace had implications for years to come. Every whispered compliment or gentle criticism rippled slowly through the corridors, influencing alliances, marriages, and occasionally minor disputes that historians now describe as softly scandalous. Let's linger a bit on the daughters too. Mughal princesses were rarely idle. They were educated, cultured, and expected to participate in courtly life with grace. Yet, like their brothers, they had quirks. Some were known to quietly manipulate minor alliances within the court, arranging marriages or subtly influencing the emperor's decisions. Imagine a small group of young women, quietly plotting for the next decade, all while wearing the most elaborate silk gowns and gently fanning themselves in the heat. That image, soft as it is, encapsulates the subtle power dynamics that made the Mughal court endlessly fascinating. And then there's the slightly comical side of imperial hobbies. Shah Jahan, like Jahangir before him, had a soft spot for gardens, exotic animals, and architectural perfection. There are accounts of him spending entire afternoons quietly measuring a terrace, adjusting the angle of a fountain, or gently instructing gardeners on the precise placement of flowers. It's a little absurd if you think about it. An emperor, arguably one of the most powerful men in the world, quietly fussing over tulips and jasmine. Yet, somehow, it worked. The palace thrived, the empire endured, and the subtle rhythm of life continued, like a slow, deliberate lullaby played in marble corridors. And of course, we can't forget the slightly peculiar habits of ministers and courtiers. Many were meticulous about etiquette, endlessly polite, and quietly competitive. They wrote long letters detailing minor incidents, whispered advice to one another, and occasionally spent hours debating the proper shade of a ceremonial robe. For an outsider, this might seem trivial, but for the Mughal court, it was essential. Every minor gesture, every subtle expression, contributed to the slow, gentle ballet of empire. Think of it as a very slow waltz, danced across gold floors, where one misstep might ripple softly through generations. Finally, let's touch on the quieter tragedies of the family. Not all children survived, not all marriages were smooth, and not all ambitions were realized. Yet, in every instance, there was a gentle dignity, a soft persistence, and a quiet, human imperfection that makes these stories linger. Some princes would grow up to quietly fail, others to quietly succeed. And through it all, the emperor's slow, patient gaze remained a constant. He was, in a way, both observer and participant, quietly guiding, occasionally grieving, and always indulging the small, absurd, yet deeply human habits that defined the Mughal court. So, as we settle here tonight, think of Shah Jahan wandering gardens, Mumtaz Mahal gently smiling, princes and princesses quietly playful, ministers whispering in corridors, and exotic animals meandering through marbled halls. Imagine the soft clink of cups, the gentle rustle of silk, and the barely audible murmur of a court that was always alive, always moving, but never loud. A world of subtle power, soft tragedy, quiet obsession, and gentle, lingering charm. And with that, we can pause for a moment, letting the soft rhythm of Mughal life drift through our minds, like petals slowly falling in a quiet garden. Part 3. The quiet rivalries and succession whispers. Alright, let's settle again. Picture the Mughal palace at dawn. The marble glows softly in the early light. The fountains ripple gently. The ministers shuffle quietly to their chambers. And somewhere in a quieter wing, the princes are stirring. Slowly, deliberately, each one aware that their life will be measured in subtle gestures, whispered alliances, and the soft, persistent ambition that hums like a barely audible clock. Shah Jahan, having lost Mumtaz Mahal, had withdrawn a little from the everyday affairs of court, leaving a vacuum that each son quietly tried to fill. There were four main contenders: Dara Shikoh, Shah Shuja, Aurangzeb, and Murad Baksh. Each had a different personality, but all shared a common, quietly obsessive goal: to eventually rule. And while modern imaginations might picture loud battles or grand shouting matches, the early stages of this rivalry were slow, soft, and meticulously polite. If you were a historian watching quietly, you might almost miss it. Dara Shikoh, the eldest, was a gentle dreamer. He loved poetry, philosophy, and mysticism. He had a soft curiosity about religion, a tendency to read quietly in gardens, and a rather delicate constitution. He could spend an entire afternoon contemplating a verse of Persian poetry, while Shah Shuja might be quietly plotting his next minor maneuver. Dara Shikoh was called the Philosopher Prince, and yes, he truly embodied that title. But the gentle problem with being a philosopher in a palace is that ambition requires sharper edges than verses of poetry usually provide. Dara's softness, admirable as it was, eventually became a liability. And finally, Aurangzeb, the youngest, yet perhaps the most quietly ambitious. Unlike his elder brothers, he had a singular focus. He was methodical, patient, and willing to let the world drift gently around him while he plotted, like a cat lounging in the sun, biding time until it decided to pounce. Aurangzeb's charm was understated. He could smile, bow politely, and sip his tea while the palace quietly reeled with subtle tension. And that, historians note, was exactly the kind of temperament that allowed him to eventually take control. No loud proclamations, no dramatic coups at first, just a slow, inevitable assertion of influence. The subtle rivalry among these brothers is quietly fascinating because it wasn't initially violent. It was whispers in corridors, polite nudges in meetings, carefully worded letters, and minor attempts to curry favor with the ministers and military commanders. Imagine a room full of men carefully drinking wine, exchanging compliments, while each is secretly imagining how a minor shift in seating at dinner might someday translate into power. It's tedious, yes, and also slightly hypnotic if you're drifting off as a listener. Now, the soft scandal here isn't just political, it's deeply personal. Dara Shikoh had a deep affection for his father, Shah Jahan. He genuinely hoped to be chosen as the heir. He composed poetry for him, consulted with him on art and philosophy, and quietly assumed that kindness and intellect might secure his future. But life in the Mughal court, as we've gently learned, isn't entirely rational. Emotional appeals, philosophical conversations, and garden strolls only get you so far when another brother is quietly accumulating supporters, strategically placing letters, and sometimes gently intimidating minor courtiers into allegiance. Aurangzeb, in particular, perfected the art of subtle coercion. He would occasionally offer a soft compliment to a minister, a quiet remark about loyalty, or a slightly exaggerated sigh at Dara's philosophical musings. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic. Yet, over months and years, these small gestures added up. And when the time eventually came, the brothers' polite rivalries escalated slowly into military maneuvers and palace skirmishes, still far from the cinematic sword fights, but nonetheless historically consequential. Meanwhile, Shah Jahan was, in the background, quietly observing. He had moments of distraction, sometimes mourning Mumtaz Mahal, sometimes inspecting a new marble balcony, occasionally commenting on the flavor of imported fruits, but the subtle tension between his sons eventually reached his awareness. And because he was, in his heart, a melancholic and contemplative emperor, he often hesitated. Decisions were delayed, soft advice was given, and the palace hummed with the almost imperceptible rhythm of generational tension. Let's float for a moment into a quieter domestic scene. The harem, as usual, was alive with gentle intrigue. Royal women whispered softly, subtly influencing alliances among the princes. Mothers offered quiet counsel, aunties arranged minor marriages, and occasionally a princess would strategically position herself to observe, unnoticed, the interactions of her brothers. These domestic negotiations were not dramatic, they were slow, deliberate, and essential. Each smile, each gesture, each carefully measured bow could ripple gently through the empire in ways historians now describe as softly destabilizing. And while this quiet courtly tension played out, the palace itself continued to function like a slow, precise machine. Gardens were pruned with meticulous care. Water channels were measured and adjusted. Artisans carved marble minutely. The aroma of incense, the gentle sound of fountains, and the occasional clink of jewelry in the harem provided a soft, continuous soundtrack to the unfolding rivalry. The empire, in all its opulence, thrived amidst the subtle chaos. It's like watching a slow river flow over golden stones. Everything moves, nothing explodes, and yet the current shapes the landscape. Aurangzeb's quiet ambition eventually bore fruit. Through patience, subtle persuasion, and carefully managed alliances, he positioned himself to take power. When Shah Jahan fell ill, the younger son's polite rivalries accelerated, and Aurangzeb quietly maneuvered into place. Dara Shikoh, despite his intellect and charm, was gradually marginalized, his philosophical musings and poetic soul ill-suited to the soft, relentless pragmatism of Aurangzeb. And so, the slow, inevitable transfer of power began. Not dramatic in the usual sense, not with great fanfare, just a whispering, inexorable tide of influence and subtle dominance. Meanwhile, the quieter tragedies of the family continued. Princes who failed to achieve their ambitions were quietly imprisoned, sometimes exiled, sometimes quietly ignored. Mothers grieved softly, daughters continued their subtle machinations, and the court adapted. Every minor action, every gesture, every word was part of the tapestry of slow, generational change. And the empire endured, even as personal ambitions collided gently behind gilded doors. One charming anecdote involves Shah Shuja, who, after a minor defeat in the slow competition for influence, retreated to a quieter province. There, he quietly surrounded himself with poetry, gardens, and the soft rustle of silk. No dramatic rebellion, no shouting matches, just a prince softly lamenting, gently plodding, and occasionally sighing at the behavior of the world beyond his walls. It's an image historians love because it's so understated. Power, loss, and quiet ambition coexisting in a single, reflective human life. Meanwhile, Aurangzeb, now steadily rising, cultivated the subtle appearance of piety and discipline. He was methodical, patient, and careful, creating a public image that contrasted with the slightly more indulgent habits of his predecessors. Yet, behind the gentle facade, there were minor intrigues, whispers of caution, and a constant, soft awareness of the familial dynamics that shaped every decision. It's almost meditative if you imagine it, every soft step, every quiet word, moving history gently forward without overt fanfare. And so, as we let the palace corridors fade into a gentle echo in our minds, imagine the slow, deliberate rhythm of life continuing. Princes, each with their quirks and subtle ambitions. Ministers, softly scheming. Daughters and wives, quietly influencing the threads of power. The emperor, contemplative and melancholic, observing it all. The palace itself, a golden, marble vessel, containing the soft turbulence of human ambition and quiet tragedy. And tonight, as you drift, imagine the gardens of Shah Jahan's palaces, fountains gently flowing, flowers slowly opening, and a prince somewhere quietly brooding over poetry while another carefully places a marble step. A world of subtle influence, soft scandal, and gentle ambition. The perfect setting for sleep. Part 4. Aurangzeb's quiet rise, and Dara Shiko's gentle fall. All right, let's settle in again. Imagine the Mughal palace, now slightly quieter. The marble floors reflect soft candlelight. The fountains ripple gently. Courtiers shuffle along corridors in a muted rhythm. And somewhere, a prince sits quietly in a sunlit room, leafing through poetry that might once have influenced emperors, but now mostly influences the slow march of memory. That prince is Dara Shiko. Dara Shiko, eldest son of Shah Jahan, had always been the gentle dreamer, philosopher, poet, mystic, lover of Sufi texts. He was the type of royal figure that might appear in a storybook. If the storybook also included quiet tragedies, subtle political missteps, and a family slowly plotting around him, Dara's approach to power was thoughtful, reflective, and, well, let it gently say, not exactly suited to the slow-burn ruthlessness of Aurangzeb. He relied on charm, intellect, and the soft sway of culture. He believed that knowledge and piety might secure his future. Aurangzeb, of course, quietly disagreed. Aurangzeb's rise wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was meticulous, patient, and subtle. He built alliances slowly, whispered promises in corridors, and never overstepped in a way that might alarm Shah Jahan. He quietly positioned governors, subtly adjusted loyalty among key generals, and waited. While Dara Shiko lingered in gardens, translating texts and composing poetry, Aurangzeb methodically accumulated influence, a gentle but steady tide that would eventually shift the course of the empire. Meanwhile, Dara Shiko's emotional temperament, soft, reflective, sometimes melancholic, made him vulnerable in the courtly chessboard. Small missteps, minor alliances gone wrong, even gentle expressions of disappointment were enough to tip the balance. Imagine, for a moment, trying to navigate a world where every softly spoken compliment or whispered observation might determine your ultimate fate. That was Dara's Mughal reality, and he moved through it with dignity and occasional naive confidence. Shah Jahan, the melancholic emperor, now watched quietly. His health was gradually declining. He had moments of distraction, tending gardens, inspecting fountains, or quietly mourning the loss of Taj Mahal. Yet he observed the simmering tension between his sons, offering gentle advice, sometimes quietly favoring Dara, sometimes retreating into contemplative silence. It's a subtle dynamic, an emperor present, yet removed, powerful, yet reflective, loving, yet slowly witnessing the unraveling of family bonds. The court, as always, continued its quiet rhythm. Ministers, princesses, and advisors whispered in corridors. Every soft interaction carried weight. Courtiers subtly advised, nieces and aunts carefully nudged alliances, and the harem continued its gentle orchestration of influence. In this world, a smile, glance, or a small compliment could ripple through the empire. And while it may seem trivial, historians now note that these minor gestures were the invisible threads holding together or quietly framed the vast Mughal tapestry. Now, let's drift into the slow, inevitable fall of Dara Shikoh. Unlike the dramatic scenes that movies might show, his downfall was gentle, bureaucratic, and relentless. First, his support among military governors quietly eroded. Then, subtle financial manipulations limited his resources. Minor betrayals, softly executed, further isolated him. Aurangzeb, quietly observing, made no loud moves. Instead, he allowed these tiny shifts to accumulate until Dara's position became fragile. Imagine a sand castle slowly eroding under a gentle tide. No sudden collapse, just the quiet inevitability of time and pressure. And yet, Dara maintained dignity. He continued to write poetry, read mystic texts, and correspond with scholars. He retained his soft charm, even as the tides of ambition pulled him gently but firmly out of power. He was, in many ways, a tragic figure, brilliant, cultured, deeply human, and quietly overwhelmed by the slow, pragmatic ambitions of his younger brother. Aurangzeb, by contrast, embraced discipline, patience, and subtle ruthlessness. He cultivated the appearance of piety, projecting a calm, measured presence that reassured ministers while quietly intimidating rivals. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely acted in haste, yet every carefully measured step brought him closer to absolute control. For historians, this is the quiet genius or the gentle menace of Aurangzeb, a man who reshaped an empire not with dramatic violence at first, but with soft, deliberate, inexorable moves. Meanwhile, Shah Jahan's own health and mood continued to ebb and flow gently. He spent long hours in the gardens, quietly observing architecture, testing water channels, and occasionally remarking on the flavor of fruits. He witnessed the slow unraveling of Dara's influence and the steady accumulation of Aurangzeb's. And though he could intervene, he often refrained, lost in contemplation or grief, allowing history to quietly unfold around him. And so, the palace itself became a subtle theater of ambition. The marble floors echoed soft footsteps. The fountains murmured. Courtiers whispered. Princes plotted quietly. Ministers smiled politely, while secretly adjusting allegiances. Even the children, now a little older, observed and absorbed the dynamics of courtly life, learning the subtle art of patience, subtle influence, and soft power. One gently ironic note: Dara's philosophical and mystical pursuits, which might have been his greatest personal achievement, were quietly ineffective in the political sphere. His charm, intellect, and soft heart were admired, respected, even mourned later by historians. Yet in the slow, deliberate calculus of succession, these qualities were insufficient. Aurangzeb's quiet pragmatism, disciplined focus, and subtle ruthlessness won out. It's a reminder that, in the soft world of Mughal politics, brilliance and kindness could be quietly outmaneuvered by patience and calculation. As Aurangzeb's influence grew, Dara Shikoh's position weakened further. He retreated to safe quarters, attempting to negotiate, persuade, and appeal to allies. But the tide was slow, relentless, and quiet. He faced exile from power not with dramatic confrontation, but with the gentle inevitability of history itself. And the rest of the court continued its subtle, humming rhythm, ministers adjusting allegiances, princesses observing quietly, children learning the patterns of subtle power, and the emperor softly grieving the complexities of life and family. By the time Aurangzeb formally consolidated power, the Mughal court had transformed quietly. The brilliance of Dara's philosophical mind, the poetry of the gardens, the subtle artistry of architectural endeavors, all continued, but now under the watchful, disciplined, and quietly commanding presence of Aurangzeb. Every step, every whisper, every small act of allegiance contributed to a slow but inexorable realignment of the empire. And as we drift toward the end of this section, imagine the soft, lingering aura of the Mughal palace, the gentle ripple of fountains, the faint scent of jasmine and roses, the subtle shuffle of servants and courtiers, and the quiet, patient presence of Aurangzeb observing everything. Dara Shikoh, gently defeated, sits quietly in a shaded courtyard, composing verses, reading texts, and reflecting on the impermanence of power. Shah Jahan, contemplative and melancholic, wanders marble corridors, and the empire continues its soft, deliberate rhythm, a whispering, golden machine of ambition, grief, subtle intrigue, and gentle human complexity. Part 5. Aurangzeb's Long Watch. So, here we are. Aurangzeb is now emperor. Quietly, patiently, and with a little too much self-control, he has managed to edge out his brothers, secure his throne, and settle himself as the ruling figure of the Mughal world. But let's be clear, Aurangzeb wasn't exactly a party emperor. If Shah Jahan's court had shimmered with gardens, poetry, diamonds, and fountains, Aurangzeb's court leaned more toward spreadsheets. Not actual spreadsheets, of course, but the kind of methodical, joy-draining paperwork that would have made a tax accountant proud. He was deeply pious, deeply disciplined, and deeply committed to austerity, which sounds noble, until you realize that austerity in a palace filled with marble, fountains, and mango orchards just feels like a very polite form of irony. Imagine living in a gilded mansion, but constantly apologizing for having too much sugar in your tea. That was Aurangzeb. Where his father had spent lavishly on architecture and monuments, Aurangzeb preferred plainness. His idea of grandeur was not having grandeur, which, for an emperor sitting on peacock thrones and surrounded by silk-draped courtiers, takes a lot of determination. And yes, he really did ban certain court entertainments. Music, for example. Musicians were politely asked to find another career, which is just about the most Mughal way of firing someone imaginable. A whole class of palace artists essentially had to rebrand themselves overnight. Some took to reciting religious verses. Others wandered into villages. Some simply kept singing quietly anyway, because let's face it, emperors can ban music, but they can't ban humming. Now, you might expect that this strict, pious, no-fun emperor would at least have had a peaceful domestic life. But no, this was still a Mughal household, which means layers of tragedy, quiet family feuds, and the slow erosion of relationships. Aurangzeb's children lived under a shadow of both expectation and suspicion. Imagine growing up with the father who never smiled at jokes, frowned at music, and quietly reminded you that worldly pleasures were basically distractions. Childhood in that palace wasn't exactly cozy bedtime stories, it was more like long lectures on piety. And yet, these princes and princesses still carried within them the same dynastic curse. Too much ambition, too much expectation, and too little freedom. One of his sons, Prince Azam, grew up restless, feeling perpetually overlooked. Another, Prince Akbar, yes, named after the great-grandfather, Akbar the Great, no pressure, ended up rebelling against his own father. Not with fiery battles at first, but with the slow burn of discontent. Family dinners were probably very tense. And since this was the Mughal court, tense dinner meant 100 servants standing silently with trays while nobody dared chew too loudly. The daughters fared no better. Princess Zeb-un-Nissa, Aurangzeb's eldest, was an intellectual, a poet, and a free spirit, which, of course, made her completely incompatible with her father's austerity. She loved literature, wrote verses, and even patronized scholars, essentially carrying on the cultural tradition that her father had tried so hard to suppress. Naturally, this didn't end well. She was eventually imprisoned by Aurangzeb himself. Yes, imagine being locked away by your father because you liked poetry too much. That was Mughal family therapy in action. And then, there was Aurangzeb's relationship with his father, Shah Jahan. Remember him? The grieving emperor who built the Taj Mahal. Well, after Aurangzeb seized power, Shah Jahan lived out the last years of his life, not as a respected elder statesman, but as a quiet prisoner. Confined in the Agra fort, with a window view of the Taj Mahal, the monument he had built for his lost love. Every day, he gazed at the marble dome while slowly fading into silence. Poetic, tragic, and deeply ironic. The greatest patron of Mughal beauty, quietly locked away by his own son who disapproved of beauty itself. If this all sounds bleak, well, it kind of was. But there's a strange calm to it too. The Mughal palace under Aurangzeb wasn't bursting with intrigue or flamboyant scandal the way it had been under earlier emperors. Instead, it was a slow, methodical suffocation of joy. Imagine living inside a painting that's slowly losing its color, fading bit by bit, until only the outlines remain. That was Aurangzeb's court. And yet, he lasted for decades, longer than most Mughal rulers. His reign stretched on, year after year, quietly grinding through bureaucracy, wars, and administration. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't charming, he wasn't even particularly liked, but he was stable, determined, and relentless. Like a metronome ticking in the background, Aurangzeb's reign kept going, and going, and going. The irony, of course, is that his very discipline, his very piety, his very control, the things he believed would preserve the Mughal dynasty, ended up hollowing it out. The empire was strong on paper, but brittle in spirit. His children were discontent, his nobles quietly tired, and the cultural soul of the court drained away. By the time Aurangzeb reached old age, he was surrounded by silence, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but heavy. A silence filled with the absence of music, laughter, and trust. In his final years, Aurangzeb wrote letters filled with regret. He admitted that ruling the empire had brought him little joy. He confessed that he had made mistakes, that he felt empty, that the crown had given him nothing but loneliness. Imagine the most disciplined man in India, after half a century of control, finally admitting in his own handwriting that he was tired, that he had lost the very things that make life gentle, that even emperors can feel hollow when all the fountains are dry. And so, when Aurangzeb finally died in 1707, he left behind not a thriving dynasty, but a fractured one. His children would squabble. His empire, stretched too far, would begin its slow unraveling. The great Mughal machine, once glittering under Akbar, once elegant under Jahangir, once breathtaking under Shah Jahan, was now heavy, weary, and tired. Aurangzeb had held it together with discipline and silence, but he had also drained it of vitality. His tomb, fittingly, was not a grand marble monument like the Taj Mahal. It was a plain grave, covered with earth, shaded by a small tree. No jewels, no domes, just simplicity, exactly as he wanted. And yet, the simplicity feels almost tragic. The man who had inherited the peacock throne chose to be remembered under a pile of dirt. It is, in its own quiet way, the perfect metaphor for his reign. Part 6. The slow collapse of the House of Peacock Thrones. So, Aurangzeb is gone. After decades of ruling with discipline, restraint, and more than a little joy-killing austerity, he left the Mughal Empire in 1707 with an exhausted treasury, discontent heirs, and a heavy silence over the marble palaces. The throne was still there, still glittering with gold and jewels, still guarded by endless courtiers and attendants. But the soul of the dynasty? That was already starting to flicker. What followed was not an immediate explosion, not some loud collapse. It was more like a slow, drowsy decline, an empire yawning itself into disarray. Aurangzeb's sons immediately began quarreling over succession, because of course, they did. No Mughal prince ever looked at his brothers and thought, you know what, I'll just let him have it. Instead, every single one seemed to wake up every morning convinced that he was the chosen one. Imagine a family board game night that never ends, except instead of Monopoly money, it's actual armies marching across the countryside. Prince Azam Shah tried to claim the throne. So did his brother, Bahadur Shah. They clashed in the dusty plains, their forces colliding, soldiers muttering quietly that they weren't entirely sure who was supposed to be emperor that week. Bahadur Shah eventually won, but only barely, and his reign was, to put it gently, short and uninspiring. Now, Bahadur Shah wasn't a terrible ruler. He just wasn't particularly memorable. He was old when he took power, tired, and more concerned with just holding things together than creating new legacies. He drifted through his rule like someone reluctantly babysitting an empire that no longer wanted to sit still. By the time he passed, the Mughal throne had already lost much of its aura. After him, the pattern repeated. Succession crises, brief reigns, squabbling princes. It was like a never-ending relay race where each runner stumbled before handing over the baton. The empire didn't implode dramatically, it just quietly unraveled, thread by thread. And here's the soft irony. The Mughal court still looked magnificent from the outside. The peacock thrones still gleamed, fountains still rippled, courtiers still flattered, and the harem still hummed with intrigue. But it was all surface. Underneath, finances crumbled. Provinces slipped away. Local rulers stopped listening. The once mighty emperors of India were turning into ceremonial figures, kept alive by ritual and nostalgia rather than actual power. Let's drift into a few of these later Mughal emperors because honestly, they were more like tragic characters in a fading play than rulers of a great empire. Take Muhammad Shah, for example. He reigned in the early 1700s, and he was nicknamed Rangeela, which translates roughly to colorful, and yes, he lived up to the name. He loved music, art, dancing, and basically everything his great-grandfather, Aurangzeb, had tried to ban. You could almost see it as karmic payback after decades of silence under Aurangzeb. The court suddenly exploded into color again. But here's the problem. Muhammad Shah was much better at enjoying parties than running an empire. While he drifted through evenings of wine, music, and poetry, the actual structure of Mughal rule kept slipping away. Nobles fought for influence. Provinces declared independence. And then, just to make things worse, outside forces began circling. The Persian ruler Nader Shah famously invaded Delhi in 1739. And when I say invaded, I don't mean politely stopping by. He marched in, smashed Mughal forces, and looted the capital. He even carted off the peacock throne itself. Yes, the peacock throne, jewel of the Mughal dynasty, symbol of imperial grandeur. Imagine your family heirloom being dragged away in front of you while you sit helplessly sipping wine. That was Muhammad Shah Rangeela's legacy. He threw parties while losing the crown jewels. Quite literally. After him, things only got messier. Successors squabbled, emperors came and went, and the empire became increasingly fragmented. By the late 1700s, the Mughal emperors were essentially figureheads. They still lived in the palaces, still sat on ornate thrones, still performed rituals, but real power was in the hands of regional rulers, Marathas, Sikhs, and eventually, the British East India Company. One of the last truly symbolic emperors was Bahadur Shah Zafar in the 19th century. He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't a powerful administrator. He was a poet. A gentle, reflective man who spent more time writing verses than commanding armies. His poetry is actually haunting, filled with longing, grief, and melancholy. Which makes sense, because by his time, the Mughal dynasty was a shadow of itself. When the 1857 rebellion broke out against British rule, Bahadur Shah Zafar was reluctantly declared its symbolic leader. But after the British crushed the uprising, they exiled him to Burma, and there, far away from Delhi, the last Mughal emperor died in 1862. A dynasty that had once ruled most of India, that had built wonders like the Taj Mahal, that had been synonymous with wealth, culture, and power ended quietly, in exile, with a poet's sigh. And so, the Mughal story closes not with thunder, but with silence. From Babur's ambition to Akbar's brilliance, from Jahangir's indulgence to Shah Jahan's grief, from Aurangzeb's piety to the long, slow decline, this was always a dynasty of contrasts. Extravagance and austerity, beauty and brutality, passion and emptiness, and above all, the quiet, relentless pull of family drama. Because in the end, the Mughal Empire wasn't just about battles or monuments. It was about people, fathers and sons at odds, brothers quietly plotting, daughters writing poetry in the shadows, widowed queens whispering advice behind veils, children growing up in marble corridors, never really free, never really safe, and emperors powerful, lonely, tragic emperors drifting through their golden cages. So, tonight, as we let the story settle, imagine the Mughal palaces now. Empty marble halls, fountains long dried up, courtyards overgrown with silence, the echo of music that once filled them, now gone. The soft shuffle of servants, the faint perfume of gardens, all faded into memory. History often remembers the Mughals for their monuments, the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, the Peacock Throne. But behind the marble and jewels, the real story was always about fragile people, living fragile lives, caught between duty and desire. And maybe that's why their story makes such a strangely comforting bedtime tale.